Hello, welcome back to Star Cells and God, the show where we discuss new discoveries taking place in science. And these are discoveries that have important theological and philosophical implications, discoveries that point to God's existence. I'm Jeff Zweerink. I'm joined by President of Reasons to Believe, Rana today, and we're looking forward to our discussion. But before we get into that discussion, I want to encourage you to subscribe to our channel, Reasons to Believe. Click on that bell icon so you can be informed of new videos. You can learn more about us at reasons.org, or you can follow us on social media at RTB_official. Well, let's get into things. Fuzz, I am going to throw it over to you. I know you got a discovery talking about the biological basis of religious belief. I'm going to put that title on it. But why don't you go ahead and tell us what's going on?
Yeah, and to start things off, I thought it would be fun to take a look at this pie chart showing the different world religions and the percentage of people around the world that ascribe to these different religious perspectives. Mm-hmm. You know, and to me, the one of the features that really stands out is that approximately 80% or so of the world's population holds to some kind of religious belief. That
80%?
Yes.
Well, I would put the non-religious and atheists. That's only like 14% there, so it's about 85 even.
Yeah,
so, okay.
Yeah. But the idea here is that even though people have this perception that atheism is on the rise, mm-hmm. that we see the rise of the nuns. Mm-hmm. The fact of the matter is, when we look at that group of people in context of the world population, mm-hmm. it's still a rather small percentage, which means that really one of the features that defines us as human beings is our religious beliefs, mm-hmm. right? That we are a species that is religious, and from a scientific perspective, the question is, well, how do we explain that, mm-hmm. right? And so scientists who look at religion as being part of our set of behaviors that define us as humans, like other behaviors, are looking for some kind of neurophysiological explanation mm-hmm. for our religious behavior or religious belief. And so there's been a number of these high-profile studies that seem to argue that there is a biological basis for our belief, for mm-hmm. our spirituality, for our religiosity. And so one of these studies that garnered quite a bit of attention a number of years ago was work done by Dean Hammer, who is a geneticist, and that work was published in a popular book called The God Gene, in which he argued that there appears to be an association between a particular gene that encodes for something called the VMAT2 protein and what he labeled as self-transcendence. And so he dubbed this gene the nickname the God gene, and argued that there appears to be a genetic basis for religious belief. Right?
So self-transcendence would mean that there's something about myself that transcends this physical world.
Yes.
More or less?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, and people come up with these terms that, mm-hmm. They're trying to define, spirituality. They're trying to define religious behavior in some kind of, definitive terms that, allow them to study this scientifically. Gotcha. And it's interesting because this particular gene encodes a protein that's embedded in cell membranes and is involved in transporting monoamines, things like serotonin and mm-hmm. dopamine from the cytosol in the cell into, or encapsulate them into these vesicles that would then be secreted at the synapse, mediating nerve transmission between different neurons. So, in other words, there appears to be some kind of neurochemical driver for whether or not a person is spiritual or religious, right? So that if you have certain alleles or versions of the VMAT2 gene, you're going to be more religious than if you had a different allele or a different version.
Okay, so in some sense, they're looking for people who are more religious, less religious, able to map that in some sort of
Right.
descriptive or in some sort of quantifiable way,
Right.
and then looking for what sort of biological phenomena matches that mapping and says, okay, here's a correlation.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, it's an association or a correlation more so than a genuine cause and effect.
Gotcha.
Right. And I can remember actually a number of years ago having an email correspondence with a fairly prominent origin of life researcher, and he just simply brought up the point, I guess I don't have the God gene.
Right.
So, this is a controversial study, by the way, and there are people who claim that Dean Hammer's data is suspect or that there's issues with the study that he did. But nevertheless, this is kind of the mindset that you see is that can we establish, again, some kind of neurochemical, neurophysiological basis for belief? There's been other studies that have been pretty high profile as well, involving functional magnetic resonance imaging, where you image the brain of the subject and then you have them perform different tasks. So in some of these classic studies, people would meditate, right, or they would go into a state where they would be in deep prayer. And they noted that the parietal lobe would become quiescent. And so they argued that the parietal lobe may play a role in religious experience. And just for
So wait a second, how does that work? Because if the say the word
parietal.
If the parietal lobe becomes quiescent, that means it quits doing anything. So how is it controlled?
Well, one of the things that the parietal lobe seems to be responsible for is our sense of self-awareness and self-identity. So the idea is that if the lobe goes quiet, then you're becoming connected to the greater reality or something like that, right?
I see what it's saying.
And just for reference, this is a gross anatomical presentation of the brain, and you can see where the parietal lobe is. It's on it's part of the cerebellum. The cerebellum. And then there's another study done where people showed, again with this fMRI technique, that the nucleus accumbens was actually the place where you saw activity during certain religious experiences. And they argued here that this is a place where you see the reward center of the brain.
So the nucleus accumbens is a location in the brain.
Right, yeah. So here's a slide showing where that region of the brain is, but it's the reward center. And so the idea here is that, you have a spiritual experience and it's equivalent to being satisfied, with certain food or it's the reward center of the brain, which means that there could very well be, something that drives us religiously that is connected to the sense of reward more so than anything else. So the point is that not to take any of these studies too seriously, there seems to be this evidence that there is some kind of neurochemical, neurophysiological, contributor to our spiritual experiences, to our religious experiences. And so it's in that spirit that about 2 years ago now, I've been meaning to talk about this paper for a while and just never got around to it till now. But about 2 years ago, a research team from Harvard Medical School and then also I think the Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston did a study where they claimed to have mapped out the neural circuitry that's responsible for spirituality and religiosity. And what they did is essentially utilized a technique called brain lesion mapping. It's actually a pretty cool technique to determine which areas of the brain seem to have a very strong association with spirituality and religiosity. Now, what they have a precise definition for spirituality in the study, and this is based on something called the temperament and character inventory. This is a psychological tool, a questionnaire that's used to characterize people's temperament and their character. And one of the measures that comes out of this is a measure for spirituality, which is defined as a stable shift in worldview toward belief in forces that can't be explained rationally or objectively. Right, so that's how they define spirituality. But there's a number of questions in there that measures the extent of spirituality that a person has. Are you a highly spiritual person or not? And then they also use...
It's kind of interesting. I mean, I've just kind of been listening, trying to absorb what you're saying, and it seems like there's a lot of worldview that kind of comes into play in how you're thinking about some of these things.
Yes.
If you're spiritual, that means there's not this rational, logical component you have.
Right.
If you're spiritual, it's just some sort of reward that you're seeking. These are not objective categories in my assessment, I guess.
Yeah, this is a good point, because what people are doing here is they're studying religion, they're studying spirituality within a scientific framework, right? So you're operating within a framework of methodological naturalism, in effect, right? So you're already presupposing that there's going to be a strictly neurochemical or strictly neurophysiological basis for belief, just like that would be for any other behavior. So there's some right.
Well, and what I find interesting about that is, I haven't thought about the specific definition there, but where we're mentioning about the reward center, there's that predicate almost that it's like the only reason you're religious is because of the rewards, as opposed to, though I'm religious and receive reward, there could be entirely. It assumes an all or nothing, which is probably not the greatest assumptions.
Right. Those are good points. Now, they define religiosity, which isn't actually a marker that comes out of the TCI.
Okay.
This is actually a concept that they've coined in their particular study. So there's no objective measure of this through some kind of psychological tool, but rather it is something that is self-reported. And they define it as a unified belief and practices in sacred things, right? So that's how they're defining religiosity. So that's how we're going to use it in this. But the idea behind this brain lesion mapping is that you try to correlate damage to certain regions of the brain with certain behaviors. And then through that process, you're able to map what regions of the brain seem to be responsible for certain behaviors. So
this is kind of like gene knockout type studies where you knock out these genes and say what happens.
Yes,
it's that sort of thing.
Yeah, classic approach to biology. Break it and see what happens. Yeah. So what they did was and this actually shows from the paper. This is giving an illustration of how they went about the work. But what they did is two separate studies. One of them involved 88 patients who were going to have a tumor resected from their brain, right?
Okay.
So the idea would be that process of removing the tumor would cause damage to a particular area of the brain, but you could map, where that damage took place. And so what they did is they administered the TCI and measured spirituality for the patients before and then after the surgeries to determine was there a change in spirituality as a result of having damage to the brain.
Gotcha.
And then, or damage to particular regions of the brain. And then they did another study where they were looking at 105 Vietnam veterans who suffered a puncture injury to the brain.
Okay.
Right, where there was areas of the brain that were then damaged because of that injury, and there they gave a survey or they gave a questionnaire that was attempting to measure the religiosity of those patients, and so this is again an illustration of how they went about the study, where you can see different areas of brain lesions, and then the types of questions that people would ask, or they would ask of the patients. What they ended up discovering is in the study where they were resecting tumors from the patients, 30 of them, of the 88, decreased their spirituality after surgery, and about 29 increased their spirituality. So the brain lesions were actually changing the way they looked at things. And then there were 29 that were unaffected. For the 105 patients that had, again, the puncture injury to the brain, 24% reported themselves as non-religious, 76% as religious. And so then they looked to see, of those people that were religious, statistically, what areas of the brain seem to be damaged, right? And so it's all, there's a statistical analysis that they did. Now, in addition to that, once they identified the region of the brain that seemed to be driving spirituality and religiosity, which is the para-aqueductal gray, and we'll talk about that in a minute, they actually, in addition to that, used what's called the human connectome. This is a remarkable project that's underway where researchers are using non-invasive imaging techniques to try to map out neural circuitry in the brain. And they're looking at somewhere between 1,000 to 1,200 healthy individuals. And so you're creating these circuits that look like this. This is an image of the types of neural circuits in the brain. But you're able to tell which circuits are located in different regions of the brain that then correlate with certain functions, certain behaviors, and then how the different circuits interact with each other, so you can tell how different regions of the brain is interacting with other regions of the brain. So it's a remarkable piece of big science that people are doing to establish this connectome. And then, as I mentioned, what they discovered is that there were that this particular area, this is kind of in the midbrain. It's something called the gray area that you see there. That's called the para-aqueductal gray that surrounds the cerebral aqueduct. And they noted that there were both positive and negative neural circuits, where, for example, if you damaged the positive neural circuit, the person became less religious or less spiritual, or if you damaged the negative circuit, that person became more spiritual. And so let me get notes here. So what they discovered again is that again, it was this para-aqueductal gray area, and this particular area of the brain, interestingly enough, is involved in fear conditioning, pain modulation, altruistic behavior, unconditional love, and pair bonding. So those are interesting.
It's an odd mix of
But when you think about it in terms of spirituality and religion, you can sort of see the connection. Now, to be fair, the researchers are are emphasizing caution and just simply saying, just because this is where the spiritual networks are, don't start over-interpreting the results, right? To say if this is the particular region of the brain that's responsible for, spirituality, either positive or negative, just because you see circuits in this, or just because that area of the brain does certain things, don't necessarily connect that immediately to spirituality. This is really, I think, the point that you were making earlier. The researchers are actually exercising caution. But then, in terms of the positive nodes, the positive nodes emanate from the positive nodes, or the positive circuits emanate from this para-aqueductal gray area, and then interact with circuits in the subcortical limbic region of the brain, which is, interestingly enough, this is the positive circuit. This makes you more spiritual. This interaction is responsible for something called the alien limb phenomena, where people feel like somebody is actually controlling their limbs external to themselves.
Really? Okay.
Yes. It's also, let's see here, a part of the brain that circuitry is also connected or associated with delusions. Right?
Okay.
Now, in terms of the negative nodes where you become less spiritual, there's a connection to the frontoparietal area, which is the part of the brain involved in reasoning, executive control, and rationality. So again, this is why they're urging caution. It's not to say that you're irrational if you're spiritual, and if you're not spiritual, you're rational.
Right.
It's just that these are the areas of the brain that seem to be involved, in terms of their interaction or their connection to the para-aqueductal gray area. So the bottom line is, this is probably one of the more detailed studies trying to understand the neurophysiological basis of spirituality. And in fact, they point out in the paper that this is important medical insight because we need to take into account the patient's spirituality and their religious beliefs when we're treating the patients. And so this is something that helps us. This understanding is helpful, in terms of medicine, just providing, the best possible care for patients. But the larger question that I'm interested in, and I'll try to do this quickly and bring things to a close, is when you see studies like this, the first reaction, and this is something that you pointed out already, is that is our spiritual nature, is our religious nature just simply, again, brain chemistry? Is it just simply brain physiology? Do we truly encounter God? Do we truly experience God? Do we truly experience the transcendence, right? Or is this just simply a delusion that we have because of our brain activity, right? And so it's reducing this very important phenomena that human beings have to simply, again, something that's completely explicable through science. And so one of the things that I think is important to do from a Christian perspective is, first of all, respect the work that's being done here, right? But then is there a way to create a model that allows us to accept the scientific insights but yet still retain a Christian perspective on our nature as human beings, where there's an immaterial and a material aspect to our being, where that immaterial aspect is actually what is truly experiencing God, right? And so that's kind of the task in front of us. And the model that I am going to propose is really inspired by a neuroscientist called Matthew Stanford.
Okay.
I always am concerned I'm going to confuse him with Matthew Stafford, the quarterback for the Rams, but but Matthew Stanford, and he's was at Baylor at one time. I think he probably is still there. I don't know.
Okay.
But he wrote a book a number of years ago called The Biology of Sin, where he kind of tackles a similar kind of problem. And I'm not going to get into the premise of the book. But in that book, he does present this model where he argues, well, if you think about humanity as tripartite, right, that there's a brain, a mind, and a spirit, right? And we could maybe even group the mind and the spirit together as the soul, right? So there's a material and an immaterial aspect to our nature, which is actually, and that there's an integration between the brain, the mind, and the spirit, which, is, from a Christian theological standpoint, is a good picture of how theologians understand our nature, right? That we're not a ghost in the machine, but our spiritual aspect and our physical aspect are integrated, right? There's a intertwinement of those two. So he argues that, look, what happens in the brain can influence the mind, and then the mind can influence the spirit. And it works in that other direction as well. So there's this dynamic interplay that takes place.
Right.
And so, the idea here would be is that, when we are born, we are in a fallen state. We're suffering from the effects of sin, right? And so there is our spiritual nature is really being driven by sin urges, and that's going to influence how we think about things, and that can influence brain activity. And likewise, what happens with our brain, how we train our brain, or just even the what we're born with as human beings can influence our mind, the way we think, and that in turn can influence our spirit.
Right.
And then when we're born again, of course, there's a renewal of our spirit, which impacts how we think, which can even impact our brain chemistry. So that's how he sees this interplay. And, it's interesting in light of that when you have the Apostle Paul in Romans saying, no longer be conformed to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. So he sees the renewing of our mind as being critical to not our salvation, but critical to our sanctification for us to grow as Christians. So there seems to be, the model that Matthew Stanford is proposing seems to be really helpful.
It does, yeah.
Right. So the way I would look at this then is that, well, if this is, again, a valid model, and there really is this hypostatic union where there's this integration between our physical and our material and our immaterial natures, then wouldn't it make sense that when God creates us, he would create our brain with these spiritual systems in place, right?
Right.
With this neurochemical and neurophysiological framework in place. And, it's also interesting that there very well could be some people, because of their brain, chemistry, their brain biology, may actually be less inclined towards being spiritual, and some being more inclined towards being spiritual. And you want to be very cautious here.
Right, yeah.
But this could, even provide some scientific basis for this idea of election, right? And I'm not sure that I fully buy, a Calvinist perspective, but again, it offers some. It's a model that offers some explanation for this idea of election.
Right.
But it also tells us too that there are things you can do to augment your propensity towards being spiritual, or to to become
diminish,
to diminish it. So the point is that these are unbelievably interesting studies.
They are, yeah.
Right, and they on the surface represent a challenge, I think, to the Christian faith, or at least they could be perceived in that way. But I think if we think deeply about who we are as human beings in light of the Christian faith, that there are models that we can propose that treat with integrity theological concepts and scientific insights.
I would agree. I love the way you said that. It's that, I almost see two extremes of what goes on there. One is that, kind of almost this idea that we're a spiritual being and we're just kind of floating around inside a body, that the spiritual is what's real about us, if you will. And, somebody made a point about that, or a comment about that. It's a really kind of warped way, given what Scripture describes. So there's just this idea that there's the spiritual and the physical is almost bad, immaterial, not something to focus on. But then there's the other side of we're just natural, we're just physical beings. But I look at Scripture and go back to your original graph that Scripture describes we're a physical and material, or a spiritual and a physical being, and we're a union of those. It would be really bizarre if the physical didn't impact the spiritual and the spiritual didn't impact the physical. That just makes sense, and you see that in the bulk of what humanity does. That there's this. It's almost like you could argue that to be human means you're worshiping something. It's just a matter of what you're worshiping.
Right.
That we're built that way, which makes perfect sense in a Judeo-Christian way of looking at it. So
right.
I think that's, when you said it, it looks like it's a threat. It seems to me it's only a threat if you haven't thought theologically about what it means to be a human. But once you've thought about that, it's like, this makes perfect sense of what it's exactly what I would expect if Christianity is correct.
There's a point that you made is that to be human means we worship something. I can never remember the title of the book, but it's written by this molecular biologist by the name of Ursula Goodenough.
Okay.
I think she's Swedish, and so the book is an argument for what she calls being a religious non-believer. And so her, as a scientist, the book is a short book, but it's like a devotional where she reflects on different aspects of nature and then has this spiritual religious response to it, right? Is in the second, after presenting the science.
Okay.
Right. And so she sees herself as being deeply spiritual, deeply religious. She just doesn't believe in God. Right. So, but she's worshiping something. So even though she would be in that 15% that would be non-religious or even atheists, she still is expressing some kind of religion or some kind of spirituality. And I suspect that's probably true for many scientists, is that they're, in my experience, even the most ardent atheist stands in awe before nature, right?
Yeah.
It has that Romans 1:20 response, where they don't choose to worship the Creator. They worship the creation, but they're worshiping something.
Yeah, and again, given what I know of Scripture, so if I just had read Scripture and said, what would I expect when I go out and look at the world? It's like you see, obviously, there's these physical things that impact you. That's clear throughout Scripture, but there's also this spiritual component, and you see that, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. I find that at times it is useful to discipline my body to do something, either in the way I think or, the physical, there's a physical activity. But if that's all I do, eventually it wears out. Where the transformation really happens is where in that time I'm also thinking differently. So the idea that our mind influences my body, that's just practically the way I've lived, where I've actually made changes. That's been an integral part of it. And I guess I just still keep going back to, or a thought I had not too long ago. It's like if I just read the Bible and then said, "What do I expect when I go out there?" And that's not a simple task, but it is straightforward in that it's pretty easy to characterize how to do that. That I would expect that we would find that the way you behave influences your physiology, the way you think influences your physiology, and the physiology influences the way you behave. And we see that. And so I like the fact that they're emphasizing that we need to be cautious about this, because it does seem like you end up in a determinism one way or the other if you're not careful.
Yes.
That, well, this is just what my genes are, this is my physiology, I have no choice. That's kind of a fatalistic, deterministic bad way of looking at things. But on the flip side, I don't get to say there's this hope that comes from, I may have a propensity towards this, that, or the other thing, but there's actually real hope that I can grow, change, mature, because I'm not determined by my biology. So I think Christianity brings great hope into that scenario.
Yeah, good point, Jeff.
So, well,
right.
Any final comments?
No, I'm all done. It's all up to you.
So I'm going to shift gears here a little bit, and I just every now and again I bring up stuff that is science related, but not a scientific study, if you will. And there were just two things that came across my desk over the past year or so, and I'm like, oh wow, that's interesting. And so I thought I'd bring them up here. Sure. And it relates to what we're thinking about how we think about doing science. And I know in the way I say this, I'm going to be characterized as falling into one group of people. But, as I've been trained to do science, there is this idea that there's a world out there. And one of the things I love about science is that you can say, well, this is the explanation, or this is the explanation, or this. And you go out and you say, all right, here's my explanation. Go out and test it. Does it stand the test of time? Does it stand up to the data? And if it does, there's truth in it. And if it doesn't, there's not truth. It needs to be modified. And it doesn't matter at some level, and people do this, so this is not a complete statement. At some level, it doesn't matter whether I'm an idiot, whether I'm black, white, tall, short, fat, happy, whatever character or physical attribute you want to put on that. It just doesn't matter. The idea is what matters. And so there have been great ideas proposed by inconsequential people that have become scientific, established thought. And there are brilliant people who've put out ideas that have just been shown, no, that's not right, and we don't think that way. So in that context, there was a class offered at Rice University. I have the first slide here. class offered at Rice University. It was listed in the catalog next to the chemistry of cooking. And so I'll put that up there just because it talks about the prerequisites and how many hours and what it is. It says, this course examines the chemistry involved in the composition, transformation, and consumption of food. Topics include chemical properties, reaction of food, cooking tools, techniques, perception, nutrition. You see the chemistry playing an integral part of there. I mean, you almost couldn't do this class without chemistry, if you will.
Right.
Right above that, if I can go to the next slide, there was a class, the chemistry of art. Again, the chemistry of materials and methods used to create, chemistry plays an integral role in there. And then there's Afrochemistry, the study of black life matter. And it says, and I'll just read it just in case you can't. Students will apply chemical tools and analysis to understand black life in the U.S., and students will implement African-American sensibilities to analyze chemistry. Diverse historical and contemporary scientists, intellectuals, and chemical discoveries will inform personal reflections and proposals for addressing inequities in chemistry and chemical education. The course will be accessible to students from a variety of backgrounds, including STEM and non-STEM disciplines. No prior knowledge of chemistry or African American studies is required for engagement in this course. Now, there's a number of things that stand out to me about that. One is that you take the chemistry of cooking. There's got to have, you're going to be taught tools of chemistry that enable you to do that. I have to wonder, what are the tools of chemistry that you're going to learn that will help you understand black life in the U.S.? I'm not even sure that is a well-defined category or something that could be, everybody has experiences, but how would you study that in some sort of scientific fashion? And that's my concern with this class, is that this is taught under the guise of the chemistry department. It's Chemistry 125 there. And that you have to have no knowledge of either chemistry or African American studies. It's like it's kind of this blank slate where I'm just kind of curious. When you see this, what are your responses to that? This seems kind of antithetical to science education.
Yeah, well, I share your confusion maybe because I can't even imagine what this course would be like.
Mm-hmm.
You think about the chemistry of art or the chemistry of cooking. When people cook, there are techniques that you use, right? And there's creativity that you're bringing to bear. In art, there are techniques you use. There's a creativity, but undergirding the techniques, undergirding the creativity is the chemical composition of the food that you're cooking, and then you're learning how to do the different techniques of cooking impact the molecules that make up that food, and how can I manipulate that to be creative? So I can immediately see what that course would be about and think, wow, this actually might be a fun class to take, right? And that it would have practical utility. But here, trying to use chemistry as a tool to understand a sociological phenomena seems to be a non sequitur. It's like, what is the relationship? Now, I can understand somebody studying the sociology of chemistry, right?
Yeah.
Right. And how does, as a human endeavor, right? How does the science, how does the practical, execution of science impact the African American community? What does it tell us about the African American life, and how can maybe chemical education, the chemical sciences be modified in such a way to be more inclusive, to be more robust, to invite a different perspective to the table to contribute to the scientific enterprise. I can understand that, but I don't see how chemistry is related to sociology in general, let alone specifically African American studies.
Well, and it's interesting. It just occurred to me in your parallel there, when you're using the chemistry to analyze cooking, effectively what you're doing is saying there's a fundamental aspect of cooking that is chemistry. That's why you can study it. And by understanding the chemistry, that allows you to actually cook better. It will provide an insight and set of tools to actually cook better. if that parallel in there, okay, so living, black life, whatever that is, black life doesn't have a chemical component. How would understanding chemistry? It's almost kind of insulting to being black. If I were to, it's like, can you actually use chemistry to understand how I live and what's going on? That seems almost kind of insulting.
Yeah.
And then to say, all right, well, chemistry can now allow you to do stuff. And it really kind of reveals it there. It says, and proposals for addressing inequities in chemistry and chemical education. That's not a chemistry problem. That's a sociological problem, to your point there. But I bring that up, one, just because I think it's important to see, to bring to light things that are being brought into the sciences as though they're science that really aren't science.
Yes.
And I'll make an argument that I'll flesh out a little bit later, that this really has a component of what tools can we use to accomplish our means, and it's a subversive set of ideas rather than a let's do science better and let's increase the quality of life in the black community better. I think it's a more subversive way of doing it, and I'll kind of get to that in a few minutes. But the reason why, so this is one of those. I will say, to Rice's credit, I've gone and looked at their catalog. This was the 2023-2024 catalog. This class was in there. I just went and looked the other day. This class is no longer in there. So I'm gathering they've got a fair bit of, for whatever reason, it's not there. I'll just leave it at that. But more recently, and this, at least as of the time we're filming this, go ahead to the next one there, there's a academicjobsonline.org. You can go there. It's job 27010. But it is a position at the University of Victoria, which I looked up. It's a fairly prominent research university in in Canada. Got an enrollment of about 22,000 students. So it's a large, research university. Physics and astronomy department is inviting applications. You see where it's open listing until May 16th of 2024 for an Indigenous science scholar on the Faculty of Science. Now, what you don't get in here is, I've got a actual printout of it. It's actually 4 pages long, where it talks about the University of Victoria, the territory acknowledgement of whose land that this was. Mm-hmm. I'm not entirely sure what to do with all that, but it's kind of like saying, okay, there are people who had this land before or who lived here before. There's a statement on the indigenization and decolonization at UVic. And so again, there are these ideas. Mm-hmm. It seems scientific, but it's also the ideas being brought in are very subversive to the scientific enterprise. And if you go on to the next one there, what I found particularly interesting about this is that it is the part that I highlighted there. This is down about 3 pages in. It's committed to upholding the values of equity, diversity, inclusion in our living, work, and environment. Pursuit of values, we seek members who work respectfully, constructively with differences across all levels of power. We actively encourage applicants from members of groups experiencing barriers to equity. In particular, we are seeking for this limited hire search candidates who are Indigenous. So you're hiring a faculty person not based on their credentials. In fact, you have to explicitly identify as Indigenous, and that credential will be checked to verify that it is. So, imagine, let's just change Indigenous to Black. I'm hiring a Black person. I'm hiring a white person for this position. I'm hiring this, again, seems like a very problematic thing. And my inclination is to look at that and say, okay, they're looking for equity, they're trying to grow, it may be misguided. And I want to be careful not to, look for a demon behind every bush type thing. But as I've been looking at this, and this is not the first example. We talked about, finding whiteness in the classroom and what that, and it's, what actually contributes to, or the factors that contribute to success. And it's not black, white, color, oppressed, any sort of thing. It's what contributes is good STEM education and strong family support and good teachers. You know, if you want to help people, that's what it takes. But there's this kind of move to say, let's make the outcomes look equal, and therefore we're going to get equity that way, as opposed to giving people equal opportunities to pursue and engage.
Right. And I mean, I would be thrilled to see a program where you're targeting indigenous people, right, and saying, how can we prepare indigenous people to excel in STEM disciplines, right? What can we do? What kind of programs can we put in place to, to handle maybe the systemic neglect that these communities experience in terms of their educational experience, and even in terms of just structural things in society that seem to prevent them from even thinking about pursuing careers in STEM. I would be 100% behind that kind of a program. But you're right, when you get to that level, particularly, at a prominent university, when you're looking for a research, faculty member, you want to bring in the best possible person that you can, regardless of, their background,
right?
Or their ethnicity, or what particular culture they adhere to, religious beliefs they hold. You want the best possible person. That's how the university is going to be served. The students are going to be served, and the broader scientific community is going to be served. Is when you've got the best people, leading the work that's required for.
Right.
For progress, right?
Well, and the reality of it is, I've thought about this in my science career. I know you've probably experienced that. It's like there's a facility I've always had with science. I mean, I'm not going to minimize that. I've also had to work pretty hard at things, but I'm also very keenly aware that becoming a scientist is a very challenging thing. Yeah. You can take very bright people, you can take even very well-motivated people, and there's just a set of skills you kind of need to have and develop. Yeah. And the example, I do physics. The language of physics is mathematics. I think anybody can learn to do math at some level, and whatever level you want. Some people are going to do it more easily, and some people are going to do it harder. So now the people who work harder at math, or it takes longer to work, the reality of them being in a physics career is that everything they do is just going to take longer, because everything requires that level of mathematical skills. So if, for example, I can do whatever math manipulations in 1 minute and it takes you 2, when we now go out and work in the lab or whatever we're doing, I'm just going to be able to accomplish a lot more, not because of any sort of power structure. It's just because I've got a set of tools that allows me to accomplish what is being done in there. All that to point out is that it's a very difficult discipline. Science is a challenging thing to get, and well-motivated people may not be able to do it. Bright people may not, because it's a combination of things you need in there.
Well, and getting through graduate school or even postdocs sometimes is just all about grit and determination, right? I mean, I knew people that were brighter than me that washed out because they weren't willing to put in the effort, right? And I knew people that I would consider myself brighter than them, but they were successful because they were willing to grind it out. Yeah. And sometimes luck is part of it too.
I'm keenly aware of that. Yeah, exactly. Well, and just even beyond that, that's why I think when you look at those successful things, the better STEM preparation you have, you're going to do better. Yeah. The more support you have. Because there were multiple times where I'm like, is this really worth it? Here I'm talking to my dad who he didn't have the benefit of having a dad like I did, but he's like, keep working on it. This is hard. It's like there's a lot of those things. So why is this important? If you go to the next slide there, a lot of why these things happen they're happening in the context of, and this is not my terminology or my work, I'm just kind of highlighting it, a book called Critical Dilemma by Neil Shenvi and Pat Sawyer kind of outline this. It's taking place in the context of contemporary critical theory. And this is important to recognize because the framework by which contemporary critical theory operates is so different than the way as a Christian, I would assume things are working, or even most people in our society, because if somebody comes at me and challenges me, I'm kind of inclined to give them the benefit of the doubt, assuming they're working for a common good, that we have a common goal or a similar framework of how we're going about things. But when you look at how critical theory operates, there's some kind of key components that Shenvi and Sawyer have outlined. One is that there's the social binary, that they're either oppressed and privileged or they're the oppressor and the privileged, or the oppressed and the marginalized. You're one or the other. You can, there's more complicated, there's intersectionality that goes in with that. But you couple that in there's hegemonic power, which are not just overt acts, that would be included, but there are these structures that maintain the domination. And the social justice that you want to dismantle system structures and the hegemonic norms. So now you look at what's going on in training students to be scientists. They take these pretty challenging classes. They've got to accomplish certain grades to be able to move on and progress. These sorts of, we're going to take Afrochemistry, we're just going to hire indigenous. It's kind of saying the structure we have designed to train and disciple people to be scientists, we're now labeling that as a power structure to oppress and marginalize people, as opposed to this is a tool that will equip you to flourish in the field.
Yeah.
And I think that's, like I said, I don't want to go out and look for a demon behind every bush. I don't know that everybody that uses this language is doing that, but right. I think we're naive to not be aware that there are, when you see overt things like this is what's going on. It's a critical theory type approach to things. It's not, hey, how can we understand the inequity in outcomes and how do we make a solution? It's saying, no, we need to radically transform all this, get rid of the structures that we have, because that's keeping the people in power, and we're elevating those who've had marginalized just simply because they're marginalized, not because they necessarily have anything to say.
Well, and maybe to be a bit contrarian. When I look at this list, and I'm concerned about the impact of critical theory, on our culture at large, just I think like a lot of people. But when I look at this, I mean, there clearly are people in our world that have advantages, and there are people that are marginalized. Those are injustices, and so it's right to point that out, and it's right to take steps to try to correct that. That there very well could be this inherent social set of social structures that actually preserves the distinction between those who are privileged and marginalized. We need to identify that and try to again rectify that. But this idea of prioritizing lived experience over evidence and special knowledge is the downfall, I think, of society, right? And to me,
and that's specifically, I think, what's going on in that hire for the University of Victoria is we're saying we're going to put someone in there that's an indigenous because they have an experience that is better than the credentials that would normally get to there. They have something that they bring because of who they are, rather than saying, are they the best person for the job that we want to accomplish here? Right. And if it's not a actual scientific position, don't advertise it as a science faculty position. It's just something different at that point.
Well, to me, I think that type of thing is highly offensive, because what you're saying is that people of a particular ethnic background or racial background aren't capable of succeeding on their own, that we have to jimmy-rig the system to ensure their success or to give them an advantage. To me, I think—
Which incidentally, that's basically the premise of critical theory, is that they are incapable. They would say it's because of the power structure, but you do have to jimmy-rig the system, because in a critical theory structure you would. So,
but to me, I think maybe we do need to jimmy-rig the system, but you don't jimmy-rig the system by making unqualified people, quote unquote, qualified, or creating a metric that they become qualified. What you do is you actually create structures or systems in place so that they genuinely are qualified through their lived experience and through their capabilities. Now, there is an area of chemistry called ethnochemistry.
Okay.
Right? And it's not Afrochemistry, but the idea there is that there are practices that that indigenous people engaged in, right, when they were interacting with the world that they lived in. And so they would, utilize certain plants for medicines. They would take certain plant materials and process them in certain ways and produce, medicines or other things. So there's a chemistry of trying to understand that, and then maybe utilize that knowledge that as a way to discover maybe new drugs or other materials that might be useful. And there I could see where you might say somebody from a particular ethnic background actually is preferred, in that particular discipline because of the nature of the discipline. So there could be situations.
Could be, yeah, I can see that. So.
Where if that person has this indigenous knowledge, they are going to, be incredibly valuable in that kind of research effort.
Well, but see there, I think you actually just made a subtle change in the way you say that. If they have that indigenous knowledge, which is different than being indigenous.
Yes.
I could, as a non-indigenous person, actually endeavor and go get that knowledge.
Yes.
And so and I think that's what I found particularly problematic. It's like we're saying, no, you've got to be this something that was kind of beyond your control. You have to be that. That's the criteria by which we're going to make a decision, rather than do you have the knowledge that will allow this to happen? Have you acquired that? And so,
yeah. To me, I think when I see this, it's deeply concerning to me on a number of fronts. But one front is that you ultimately are going to be putting people into positions they truly are not qualified for. And they're destined to fail. And I think we would be much better off in terms of correcting the injustices that exist by really working hard to make people capable. Otherwise, what's going to happen is there are going to be certain marginalized people that become even more marginalized. Right?
That's a pretty profound point there, because I mean, if good or I'm drawing a blank. A good support system is important for doing that. What does a support system do? They don't tell you to go to they tell you to go to the school that's not the most elite. They go to the one that you're going to thrive in. It's like they do things so that you experience success and grow and go through the challenges. They don't put you in places where you're going to fail in a devastating way. And kind of what you're talking about is you're putting people in a place where they're going to fail very easily in a devastating way.
Right. Or you're going to say to that community and to the young people in that community, you really don't need to work hard. You really don't need to prepare. It's all going to be given to you by virtue of trying to correct an inequity. But in reality, it's not going to really do that. Because at the end of the day, results matter.
They do, yeah. No, you're right.
At the end of the day, when the rubber meets the road, results matter. And those people that produce the results are going to be the ones that ultimately get the rewards. And so you may be able to populate a science department with faculty members that really are not qualified and retain those people in those positions, but they're never going to be productive and they're never going to have results. They're never going to get the genuine recognition that they deserve, that they could have potentially
done,
if they were actually trained.
Yeah, I think that's very important. And I think kind of what I wanted to just highlight here is that there's a part of this where a lot of these things, there are genuine injustices. And a lot of this language sounds good. You want equity. Having a diverse group of people in thought is good. It's all good stuff, but it's I was just thinking of the Gibeonites as Israel was coming into the Promised Land. And, what did they do? They went out and they wore ragged clothes and had stale bread, and they were deceptive to accomplish a goal. And I do think what critical theory is trying to do is there's a deceptive nature about it, to try and get in and be a part to accomplish a goal that we really don't want to happen. Because if we transform to a world where there are oppressors and oppressed, and that's the way people are looked at, that's going to be detrimental. There's a lot of people that are going to be injured for that. The way Judeo-Christianity looks at the world is just so much healthier, better way to look at it. And so I do think we need to be vigilant, to be aware of that subversive nature, and yet at the same time care about the individual person you're dealing with. And so I think it's a challenge, but I think it's something we're called to do as Christians.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, Christianity clearly challenges all to stand against injustice, right? To treat every human being with dignity and respect because they bear God's image, and to do what we can for human beings to genuinely flourish. Right. And sometimes that means people have to take the hard road, but, we need to be willing to walk with them on that hard road so that they do have success.
Yeah. And at the end of the day, it works, because most of the things that are the most rewarding and valuable to me are the things that were hard. And so, if we subvert that, we're actually robbing people of what's how they're designed to flourish, if you will. So.
Good point.
Well, thanks, Fuzz. I really appreciate the conversation. Hope you've enjoyed our conversation on Star Cells and God today. I want to encourage you to join the discussion in the comments below. Remember to like this video and to subscribe for more content. New episodes of Star Cells and God release each Wednesday. They're available here on YouTube and on your favorite podcast app. Make sure you share this video with somebody, maybe even get into a good conversation with them about it. And remember, the more we know about science, the more reasons we have to believe.